All right. Hello, everybody. And this is our first attempt at recording what was supposed to be a horror podcast until all of our recording programs just decided, nah, not today. So in this time of quarantine, we will be recording this off of Zoom. So, hello
Yay!
everyone, and welcome to what is currently being called the View from 6 Feet Under. Um, my name is Milo. I will be one of your hosts, and over here is.
Hi, I'm AG. I am a host with the most. I was invited to be a part of this, and we'll see how it goes.
So part of it is we're still trying to figure out if we want 2 or 3 rotating guests, depending on what episode we're discussing, or if we're going to have 2 solid hosts all the time who invite guests in. But AG is a friend of mine who I feel like has some excellent discourse on horror and who is excellent to play off of. So I've kind of invited them in here for at least this first episode to get the proverbial ball rolling. Okay, so we have introduced ourselves and we have introduced this magnificent show. Like I said, currently entitled The View from 6 Feet Under, but I suppose the next question to answer is what exactly is this show going to be? So, I have actually wanted to do a show like this for many, many years. I originally had another partner. I had so many episodes written up, and everything just sort of fell apart years ago. But, uh, what the hell? We're all locked inside of our houses now, slowly losing our minds and contemplating killing our neighbors.
That happened many, many years ago. It's okay. This is just
Telltale heart style. So, The View from 6 Feet Under is meant to be a show discussing horror. And I don't just mean horror movies, I mean TV shows, comics, mythology, every one of the myriad of ways that horror touches our society, touches other societies, and has kind of helped mold who we are, and how our different forms of entertainment can be used as education or even as a reflection of what we're worried about or kind of what we hold as morals and values. Not only that, but I am a long-time diehard horror fan, so I also just wanted an excuse to talk about horror.
never a bad time to talk about horror.
Never a bad time to talk about horror. Ever, ever. And so next up is kind of what format are we looking at for the show? So this is going to be a discussion show. Like I said, it was originally intended to be a podcast and maybe one day will be a podcast. If we can ever get all of that pulled together. So basically, the format is going to be a little bit variable, but what we're hoping to do each episode is introduce what the episode is going to cover, introduce some themes or some examples of what that subject is. So say I know that we have an episode set up for some point in the future that's going to be the Kill Billy genre for films. So we'll talk a little bit about what the Kill Billy genre is. We'll discuss a couple of films that fall into that genre. And then we'll have sort of a free discussion period where we talk about what's the societal impact of this? Why did this genre come about? And why does this genre still exist? Because it very much still does. All right, and so I feel like the last thing to talk about here in our beginning portion are a list of disclaimers. So for starters, we are not sponsored in any way, shape, or form. We are 2 nerds who really wanted to talk about that spoopy stuff. Literally nobody is asking us to do this. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure people are begging us not to. Somewhere.
He is definitely holding a gun to my head for this. Please save me.
I mean, you can't see it, but maybe I am.
Breaking social distancing.
I wonder, can ghosts break social distancing? Is astral projection breaking social distancing?
Oh no.
I
Found
wonder.
the loophole.
Oh no, so we know that COVID-19 can infect the flesh, but can it infect the astral form?
Well, hell.
Maybe maybe a discussion for another episode, but that is not to make light of COVID-19. It is actually a very terrible thing that is currently plaguing not only our nation, but other nations around the world. And actually, that's something we might want to keep an eye out on as new horror episodes develop, which brings us to another disclaimer. Horror as a genre, no matter how you perceive it, is going to talk about difficult subjects. So I would like to go ahead and warn viewers ahead of time that we will be dealing with sensitive topics like gender, race issues, pandemics, terrorism, all of the different things that feed into human fear might appear on this show. We'll try our damnedest to put trigger warnings up before everything, because my personal belief is, while horror is meant to tap something deep and dark inside of us, I feel like you are not receptive to it if you are too deeply triggered. And it's fun to make people think. It's not fun to freak people out. So we
and we're
are
here for fun, so we don't want to make anyone super uncomfortable. Make a little bit uncomfortable to think, but
we want to keep our spoops at about a solid 8. Let's not bury the needle on that one. So yes, we will be dealing with sensitive subjects because that is the nature of horror. However, we will try and be careful, and we will try and tag any triggers. Try and tag any triggers.
Found a new tongue twister there.
Indeed we did. A podcaster tongue twister. And we'll try and tag those before the episode goes up, whether it is a facial recording like this or whether it is an audio recording. Let's see. The second, or well, it's the third disclaimer really that I wanted to go to, is we are horror fans. We are going to be dabbling in things like psychology and sociology and history, but we, or at least I, am not a PhD student.
Last time I checked, I am not either. So I don't know. I might be living in some alternate dimension here, but no, I am very much not an expert either. I enjoy horror and I enjoy talking about horror, but by no means are my views on here the be all end all to all horror opinion.
Right. And I'm an archivist. So I am an archivist and a clerk who occasionally kicks people in the face for fun and profit. We are enthusiasts. We are not experts. So please enjoy the show. And if you feel like there's more to add, go out and do it. Knowledge is cumulative. So please, if we touch on something like the eco-horror impact of the Quartermass experiment, but we don't cover everything, please feel free to go out and add more to that knowledge. Not only that, we haven't seen every horror movie ever made. We haven't read every horror book ever published. There's going to be a few gaps there. So please take everything with a grain of salt. Enjoy this show as two fellow enthusiasts who are who are really just wanting to discuss things that they enjoy. But please do not assume that we are trying to say that we are the last word in horror, because we are not.
No.
And that leads us into the final disclaimer of the show, which is we may not have the same opinions or views as other horror fans. This is a discussion show. That means some of you may find that the Saw films were utterly repugnant, whereas AG or I may actually have really enjoyed one or two of them. Or some people may super duper love the torture porn genre, whereas it is not my cup of tea. Again, we are not experts. We are enthusiasts.
Opinion, discussion. These are key words here.
Indeed, they are. All right. So now that we've talked kind of about what the show is meant to be, obviously it will evolve as time goes on, or if we want to put it in more spoopy terms, it will mutate as time goes on, as entertainment media often does. But let's go ahead and kind of introduce ourselves. So as we already introduced, my name is Milo, and this is AG. So, but now let's get a little bit of in-depth about who we are. So, AG, if you'd like to talk a little bit about yourself to our viewers, go ahead.
Oh, Lord. I'm AG. I'm a 20-something person who lives in Florida, arguably some of the most horrific places in the United States.
We are a Mad Max prequel. I think we all need to just need to get over it.
We just need to accept that we're a Mad Max prequel. Shout out to my fellow Floridians. I have been into the horror genre for quite a long time, possibly earlier than I should have been. But it was definitely a formative part of my youth, whether it have been films or books I snuck in the middle of the night at home, or getting into more of like the psychological thrillers when I was getting older and like actually understanding the films for being something more than just scary. What else? I work in a comic book store. That's fun.
You do.
But that's me. A little like picture of me.
So my name is Milo. I am like I said, I am an archivist, which essentially means I work for a publisher and I take care of our archives. Not I am the, spoiler alert, avatar to an eldritch fear god that collects knowledge. Shout out to the Magnus Archives, which is one of our favorite spooky podcasts. But yeah, so I work as an archivist, but my formal training was as a stunt fighter. I have a certification from the British Academy of Dramatic Combat. And so I kick people in the face for fun and profit. And occasionally I do choreography work for some of the local theaters in town. I live with two cats. One who is 12 pounds of squirrel in a 6-pound bag, and one who is my little familiar. And that leads us on to the second part of our introduction, which is really, what are our favorite kinds of horror? And let's kick it back to AG.
I feel like that is such a broad question, but I am going to answer it to the best of my ability, because unfortunately my favorite type of horror changes with every horror movie I watch. Mm-hmm. For sure. I guess the psychological thrillers are a particular favorite of mine. Aesthetically, though, I really am into some gothic horror. Like Crimson Peak is one of my favorites.
Crimson Peak is perhaps the height of aesthetic. Now, there are some who argue that Crimson Peak, from a narrative standpoint, was not as strong as it could have been. But if we are talking about nailing the aesthetics of Gothic horror, it's a showpiece and it's gorgeous. So
Yeah. I could possibly, well, I like the music too in that film, but just going off that theme, I could possibly watch that just on mute on a massive screen and be happy just over and over and over again. Just facefuls of Gothic horror, please, thank you. But I also really like monster horror, but at the same time, sometimes I get pulled out depending on uh like effects and visual effects. I prefer practical effects to CGI, but then sometimes CGI is superior. It really depends on uh,
So when we
the
say
movie for
when
me.
we say monster horror, are you talking like kind of kaiju monster horror, or
Yes,
okay, or are
definitely
we
kaiju.
okay, so kaiju, which
Yeah,
is super classic. I actually happen to grow up in Japan, so I have a very soft place in my heart for the kaiju genre. Even if I can't name every film, I just get this little spark of joy in
yeah.
my heart. Um, so yeah, and I guess for me, I really, really enjoy bleak films. I am definitely a big fan of, if you're gonna go horror, go all the way. And so I like films that don't necessarily have what is commonly known as happy ending syndrome. So I love the original cuts of 28 Days Later. I love Midsummer, which such a beautiful film if we want to talk about aesthetic. And it was one of those very rare films that kind of defied classic horror genre by having everything horrific happen, not only in full view for the most part, but in full daylight,
Mhm.
which is really not what your classic Western horror fan is used to seeing. And I loved the reversal of that. I also love the original ending of The Descent. And I enjoy films that kind of show how small humanity actually is. They kind of knock me for a loop, so I can't really indulge in that genre too much, because no matter how much you like it, it is very daunting to realize how small you are. But it's also very interesting to find films that are willing to go there. So I am a big fan of them. I also am a big fan of bizarre horror movies, like Ichi the Killer is perpetually one of my favorite watches. Houseu, which is just fantastic. It is one of my favorite films to show people. But I also really, to that end, I enjoy um a lot of the ghost films that came out of Spain and Mexico. So that's a lot of your Del Toros and El Orfanato are all very, very special to me. And I also have a huge boner for zombie movies. Once we eventually get to the episode, because I promise you there will be an entire episode about zombies, um, you will be subjected to my deep and baffling theories about zombie films and how they reflect humanity during any given decade. But you're not going to have to deal with that today. That is many episodes down the road. Um, so moving on from what are our favorite kinds, do we have any specific titles that we enjoy? So like films, comic books, books, even if there's a favorite myth that we enjoy. Um, What do you got?
Well, I think we have touched on this before, and reminding back to the disclaimer, not only will we necessarily have differing opinions from the viewers, possibly we have differing opinions from each other.
Mm.
Uh, and so my favorite horror film, like, that was one of the first that I remember understanding at a higher level, because I did watch quite a few horror films when I was younger. Um, but Silence of the Lambs is,
Uh,
which I know Milo is not a fan of, which is totally fine because
it's
enjoying a genre is so subjective.
so for
But
the sake of discussion, since it is a discussion show,
yes,
I actually love the whole concept of Silence of the Lambs. I think the books are, while they're not high art, they are a lot of fun. I very much enjoy the Hannibal TV show. I thought a lot of the other films were really worth their salt, but I have an issue with the way Anthony Hopkins was directed in Silence of the Lambs, because I did a master's in aberrant criminal psychology and criminal behavior, and one of the things you find time and again is the level of pants on head lunacy that Anthony Hopkins portrays in Silence of the Lambs. It's just, while it does happen, it doesn't actually mesh with a lot of the charismatic mental illnesses that you will find, or mental aberrations you will find. It's not believable to me. Clarice Starling wouldn't run off with that. I love Mickelson's quiet menace, where he acts like a perfectly normal human being, but it is reptilian from the bridge of the nose up, just dead-eyed. And it's like, that I'll believe. And I'm
if you
sure I'm
want to
gonna,
qualify, Nicholson is my favorite Hannibal for sure.
yes, he is
NBC's
remarkable.
Hannibal tops, I think, Silence of the Lambs as far as like Hannibal perception goes. But as far as favorite horror film that shaped like an opinion on horror, or like really kind of like hooked me,
Yeah.
Silence of the Lambs was probably, I don't know if it was because that was quoted, think what you will about this, but like was quoted around the dinner table for years as a kid. My family was very strange. It's fine, but that was kind of like formative years of horror opinions for me, was Silence of the Lambs. But clearly not believable for a charismatic killer that Hannibal Lecter should and would perhaps have been.
But let's go ahead and throw out there, it is a classic, and it is a classic for a reason. And I'm pretty sure, even though I haven't given out our addresses, there's going to be hate mail for that. Like, I'm already visualizing the comments, and they're going to be personal and weirdly aggressive.
Well, you
And
haven't made it on the internet until you get hate comments, so that's what I've been told, at least.
ugh. Okay, so for me, I'd have to say that, oh gosh, favorite horror movies. Oof. Oof, that's like asking me to pick a favorite child. Um, I will
Do it, Milo.
I will definitely say that one of the horror films that has stuck with me for years and years and years, and I've already said its name, it is El Orfanato, or The Orphanage. It is a remarkable film. It deals very heavily with not only ghosts, but our perception of ghosts, um, as well as how we can perceive stressful events. And it is a wonderful film that will punch you in the gut. And I do recall watching the film one day, and I was so horrified by the end that, you know, that when you're like crying so hard, no sound is coming out,
Oh yeah,
it's just sort of
that's powerful. Yep.
convulsing. Yeah, that one hurt me on deep fundamental levels. So
Oh man.
it is definitely one of my favorites. But I also enjoyed like some campier ones. Like, I will absolutely watch Herbert West Reanimator over and 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 over again, even though it is, again, it is not high art, but jeebers, there is something about that movie I cannot stop watching it.
Well, there's something to said about like campy horror. Like for all intents and purposes, like The Witches. Do you remember that?
Do you mean one of the many reasons that I think that Roald Dahl was actually one of the most prolific horror authors known to man? Like, this man...
That screwed me up so bad as a kid, but I would watch it over and over and over again.
That man terrified me as a child. Like, I was pretty sure that Roald Dahl was meant to be a horror author as a child. I was very messed up by a lot of his stuff. And it's funny because I'm a pretty prolific horror movie watcher and comic reader, and book reader and video game player and all of that fun stuff. But nothing has ever scared me as bad as frickin' Willy Wonka did. Nothing has ever touched or damaged me on as deep a visceral level as frickin' Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
Now, is it the film as a whole, or the book or the film as a whole, or is it that one specific scene where they're going through the tunnel? Because that's what gives me nightmares.
Would you believe the tunnel never upset me? My biggest thing was I was so fucked up during the film as a small child believing that all of these kids died. I was so upset that I didn't make it to the very end of the film.
Oh no.
And to this day, even though I know that's clearly not what happened, that deep initial imprint doesn't go away.
It's just there to stay.
Yeah. And so I will say, if we're gonna have a talk about what scared me the most, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, hands down. Hands down. But let's see, other horror movies that I have really, really enjoyed. As I said, I like the ones that kind of sucker punch. So Ty West actually released a film a couple years back that was a retelling of the Jonestown Massacre, and it was called Sacrament. And it was perhaps the best found footage horror movie I have ever seen in my life.
What was it called?
Sacrament. It was Ty West, Tiwest. And it was deeply upsetting to me. And partially because I personally felt like it kind of looked in on a Jonestown situation. It did not try to make itself Jonestown without being like, yes, at points it was creepily voyeuristic because it was found footage, but it was almost meant to be that way. And of course, people are free to disagree with me. I don't actually know how many people have seen The Sacrament, but it was one of those that stuck with me quite hard. So I do appreciate that film quite a bit. And again, whenever I'm asked what's my favorite horror media, it's just like, bam, there's so many. It's just a wall, and trying to pick ones out of the ether is difficult. But branching away from film, I also really enjoy, like I said, Magnus Archives is a fantastic horror podcast, which I believe is in its 5th season right now, and final season, if I am not mistaken.
Oh no, final season.
Trust me, when you get there, you'll understand.
I'm working on it.
And, you know, not to give out any spoilers there for anybody who may be behind or who may be considering Magnus Archives, which again, I do encourage you to do. It is definitely in the eldritch or cosmic horror genre, and it is deeply engaging. And if you want kind of an idea of how the plot works, it is, you better get yourself some tickets to the Chekhov's gun show. So,
Oh, boy.
and then as far as comics go, of course, there are like the perennial classics. There's Sandman, which I do consider a facet of horror. There's goodness, there's the Hellraiser comic series, which was amazing. And then Colleen Duran recently released a reprint or a retelling of the Snow White mythos that actually takes on an entirely new angle that I've never seen before. AG, you actually you got that one in your comic shop, didn't you?
I did, yeah. I bought it. I'm about halfway through it because it takes me 8 years to read anything, but it's very good. It's definitely a spoopier retelling, for sure. I believe it's called Snow Glass Apples.
No, it is, I believe. Oh goodness! Now you've done ducked
I've
me
done
up.
it.
I believe it is Snow Glass Apples. Yes,
Yes.
written by Neil Gaiman and artwork by Colleen Duran, who a lot of our other nerds may recognize as having done the original series, A Distant Soil, which I grew up on, and doing artwork for both DC and Marvel over the years. So, two legends. Definitely recommend that comic, especially for anyone who is a fan of genre benders, because it kind of is.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, beautiful artwork. It's a beautiful little book too. I wish I had grabbed it, but forgot about it.
Mine
As
is
my mind
back
is what to
on
do.
my shelf. So but yes, Snow Glass Apples by Neil Gaiman and Colleen Duran. If you guys have not seen it, again, we're not sponsored. We're just screaming about things that we happen to think are very important additions to a genre that we love very much.
Yes, if we ever name drop something, it's because we just enjoy it. It's not because anyone's paying us to do anything.
Let's put it this way. If someone's paying us, we'll let you know. But go ahead and assume nobody's paying us.
Wine and tequila, it's fine.
Oof. All right. Wait, are you saying you're drinking wine and tequila together?
No, no, no. There's only one of those things in this cup.
Okay, because that was what I heard, and I had a moment of, honey, are you okay?
The answer to that question is always no, but I digress.
Honey, we dead inside. We don't need you real dead. All right. So, again, moving us swiftly along. So, in that case, you already kind of got into it with your kind of last answer, but what really drew you to horror? I know you said it was sort of Signs of the Lambs started getting you there, but what was the path for you finding your way here?
So when I was growing up, I was the first child, so like a lot of the stuff that I was exposed to was at a very limited uh experimental stage for my parents. um so like I didn't have a lot. I didn't get into like anime very early because they were like, oh, Cartoon Network is a sin. And uh so I accidentally watched The Birds, Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, when I was like 8 years old. I can
Be
tell you the
Hedron.
day too. It was a Wednesday. I had gone to 7-Eleven after first grade, uh, like to get a Slurpee because that's what you did in the 90s, I guess. And sorry. And we came back and just turned on the TV, and we didn't have like the fancy cable. We had just like whatever was on the
Like Channel 20, Channel 51,
yeah, I
Channel
can't
3,
remember what it
Channel
was,
6, Channel 9.
but it was, yeah, it was just on. And I guess my dad, who was the stay-at-home parent, wasn't paying attention but I plopped myself down in front of the television and watched the entirety of The Birds. And became unintentionally obsessed with this movie. Now, it was for no other reason than I was just like consumed by it. It was abject terror at first, because the idea that like, because I don't know if it's this way everywhere, but like the telephone wires are covered in birds at all times in Florida, or at least when I was a kid, like just
Birds and squirrels.
stacks on stacks on stacks of birds. So to think that power could come down and get me as a kid was horrifying. But then like I asked all these questions about like the movie and about the genre, and later on I learned more about like how it was kind of an allegory to the birds punishing humans for taking taking nature for granted, and like punishing sexuality, and like there was a bunch of like
Other themes.
other themes that I didn't catch as an 8-year-old.
Which, that was interesting. Hitchcock, you seem to find that in some of his films. Not the eco-horror aspect. That was sort of a one-off for the birds, but there was a lot of the punishment of sexuality, or even warped sexuality, in a lot of Hitchcock films. Like, obviously, the most ridiculously easy answer to that is going to be Psycho. So question then, is The Birds your favorite Hitchcock film, or did another kind of step up to take its place? Because I know my favorite.
I think View from the Rear Window
Rear Window is my favorite.
took its place as I got older. Like college held a lot of Hitchcock movie nights at one of the theaters there, and so I would go and see them and rekindle my quote obsession with it. As problematic as Hitchcock turned out to be, but like his movies were classic, and
Honey,
I
we're in the
chose
horror genre. Problematic is kind of what some of our
is
creators
kind
are.
of what's happening. Yeah.
Trust me, we're going to have an entire episode discussing cosmic horror, and we're going to be talking about all of cosmic horror, not just Lovecraft, but we are definitely going to be touching on the fact that Lovecraft was a very problematic man. One
Yes.
of the keystones of that particular genre, but also a problem.
Yeah, definitely Rear Window took over as favorite, but The Birds, I think, has cemented itself as a favorite in the back of my mind as a kid.
So are you ready to laugh really hard at me?
Please.
So I was actually a huge weenie as a kid. Like, the biggest pee pants scaredy cat in the world. I was kind of a reclusive little nerd, and I read things like Sword of Shannara and Chronicles of Narnia and The Hobbit. I was a huge, huge nerd, but I was really easy to scare. Like, I remember when Jumanji came out in theaters, the original Jumanji with Robin Williams. I remember when it came out in theaters. This was back before we had stadium seating, and one of the things they had was they would have all the seats out, and then there would be a bit of a half wall in the back of the cinema, like at the old AMC 24s. And I remember all throughout Jumanji, I would get up, dive out of my seat whenever I thought something spooky was going to happen, and I'd run behind that little half wall, and I'd peep out. I was so scared by everything. Like, I part of it was I didn't realize it was potentially early manifestations of my anxiety and my paranoia, where unfamiliar places seemed scary to me, and so I would start imagining the worst that could happen, and a lot of that extrapolated onto film. Like, I remember I went to go see Carmina Burana in South Carolina with my friend, and it was a beautiful, beautiful piece. Yes, the whole symphony orchestra, it was gorgeous. But I spent the whole time so petrified that something scary was going to happen. And of course, now through the adult lens of a 30-something man, I realized that part of it was because I was in a very brand new place and I didn't know a whole lot of people there, so it seemed scarier. But putting it back simply, I was the biggest wuss ball. Like Gremlins, Gremlins 2 even, which is considered categorically one of the least frightening horror films of all time. I had a babysitter show that to me when I was like 8, and I had no idea what it was, and I spent the next 3 months terrified. Nightmares every night, couldn't open my cupboards, couldn't open the microwave. I had to like poke it with a stick first.
Oh my Lord, no.
I was a huge baby. But I'd say possibly my first step into horror was I spent a lot of time in our library. And our librarians didn't always check everything that came into the library, which means sometimes spooky books would slide through. And I actually had the horror start that a lot of current Gore, Hounds, and Scream Queens have. Scary stories to tell in the dark.
Rock on.
I remember part of what drew me in was the art was so strange. I'd never seen anything like it in the small southern Christian town where I was going to school. And I was drawn to it, and I checked it out, and I read it all, and then didn't sleep for 2 days. But there was something electric in that feeling. And of course, we could talk about chemicals all we want, that it's adrenaline and then the relief from the adrenaline. But it was the first step for me. And then the thing that kind of did me in entirely was I was at a sleepover. I think it might have been that same year or the next year. And we were watching, well, the birthday girl decided that she wanted to watch Poltergeist.
Oh, no.
And of course, you know, I was already kind of an outcast at school and I was kind of lame. And it didn't help that my mom was a teacher. Like I
That
had,
never helps.
oof,
I feel
I had nothing going for me. I saw the inside of so many dumpsters before the end of high school. But it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I have to get on to get along. So I kept my mouth shut, even though I was shaking my little boots, and we watched Poltergeist. And it was kind of a revelation because I kind of knew what I was getting into this time. So it didn't scrape my brain raw the way that Gremlins did when I was, a young wee soft thing who had no idea what I was getting in for. But I'm kind of grateful that that's how my horror journey started, because that kind of helped me not be pushy about it. Like, there's a difference between really absorbing a horror that you're going to carry with you and being kind of damaged by something that you weren't entirely prepared for or wanting.
Mhm.
So, as much as I didn't necessarily like the first step of the journey, I definitely think it was important for me as a future horror aficionado. So we've talked a lot about what we want the show to be and who we are and, our journey into the darkness, as it were. So let's actually talk about what horror is, because I feel like we need to go ahead and sort of set a standard that's going to carry us for the rest of the show. So let's go ahead and look at horror. I have a couple definitions here. So Merriam-Webster has a couple different entries for horror. Merriam-Webster says that it is a painful and intense fear, dread, or dismay. It is also an intense aversion or repugnance. And then the second entry for Merriam-Webster is the quality of inspiring horror, repulsive, horrible, or dismal quality or character. And then there is also something that inspires a feeling of horror. And then if we go over, interestingly, there's actually sort of a definition for horror as it is meant with books, comics, video games, and film media, and that is, it is media that seeks to elicit fear for entertainment purposes. Initially inspired by literature from authors such as Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, and Mary Shelley. So do we have any real disagreements with that, or can you really disagree with a definition?
I mean, as far as horror as like a film genre or a comic or book or video game, I think it is, sure, at its base like definition. I can't argue with Merriam-Webster in any way, but horror means a bunch of different things for me. Like I have anxiety as an adult and I had anxiety as a child, but I don't necessarily equate that as horror. Um, Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But then, like, also, I sometimes don't equate it to being, what was the exact wording? Like, extreme or intense feeling of dread. I feel like horror can also be that creeping feeling of dread. But
Which actually, interestingly enough, leads me into sort of the next question is, what are some common impressions that you think people have of horror? Because I know that me, especially when I'm talking to people who aren't necessarily horror fans, I hear a lot of people who have ideas of what they think horror is. And I feel like oftentimes those ideas and impressions are a little bit, I feel like they're kind of diminishing horror, because all horror really has to do is it has to either inspire that aversion or dread, or I feel like we can even broaden that out a bit and discuss that maybe horror can be about those feelings of aversion or dread. Because here's the thing. Let's actually take Midsummer as an example, because you and I have both seen Midsummer. We've both picked it apart. We both love it. Midsummer is not a film that inspires any dread in me. I actually find it kind of a very aesthetic, triumphant film, and I focus a bit more on the feminist aspects of it. But for all that, it is no less of a horror film, because I feel like it touches on departures from what we conceive to be polite society. It sort of goes places that the horror genre should, and there are people who have found it very frightening and who find it deeply unsettling. So that's kind of why I want to confront different impressions people have of the horror genre or stereotypes, and why perhaps we need to think in broader terms for what
yeah,
horror is.
especially with like, speaking of Midsummer, it took me like I watched it 3 times before I could actually say that I really enjoyed it as a movie. I went to the theater knowing I hadn't seen a single trailer of it. I didn't know what it was. I just knew that it was the same people that did Hereditary, which I had seen previously. And it it shocked me in a way, not just for shock factor, but it turned everything that I knew the horror genre to be on its head. And I think that's what ended up, other than like like you were saying, the triumphant like uh, feeling that I got in the end. Um, that's what kind of really draws me to that film, is the kind of, my perception of horror was kind of flipped. um, but I think horror, labeling something horror is a very personal thing, because some things can disturb one person and not affect another person at all. But I still think that the intent of the film kind of defines it as a horror film, um, at its base. Whether it's trying to make you feel that kind of sense of dread or horrifying feeling or disgust or discomfort. And I think Midsummer did that in a way that was kind of crept up on you. It didn't necessarily, it didn't have all the earmarks of traditional horror films. It was completely in the sunshine for one, um, for most of the film, and it was very bright and yellow, and colorful.
I think um, one of the things that's very important to note is we have to view horror through our own personal lens, which means that you and I found a film like Midsummer to be slightly more triumphant because we have both been in very bad, isolating situations where Danny's liberation had a different flavor to us. There was a different texture to
Hmm.
that ending on shall we say our mental palette, where there are people who may not have had experiences that were similar or may not have even had experiences anywhere near that. So they don't necessarily view Danny's liberation the same way that we do, and they may not even see it as a liberation because depending on how you view it, the ending could be seen as a brainwashing.
Hmm.
Um, and I know we keep mentioning Midsummer a lot, but Midsummer is such. I'll go as far as to say it's a genre defining film because it can be, or at least it's defining for my purposes of horror, because it can be interpreted so many different ways. But um, from there, I know that one of the main stereotypes that I deal with when I am talking to people about horror is, well, horror is very unintelligent and it's about skimpy co-eds. And I feel like a lot of people's perception of horror kind of stops at the 80s. It kind of stops with the genesis of the slasher flick. Well, let's go ahead and say it's not the genesis because technically the slasher genre has existed a much longer period of time. But what we classically understand to be the slasher renaissance, shall we say, which those are two words
That's,
I never
yeah,
expected to come out of my mouth together.
slash Renaissance. I love it.
Yes, but I feel like a lot of people's concept of horror stopped at that slasher renaissance. Um, and then they didn't like it, which is understandable. That era was kind of built on cult classics. And then, we had the video nasties before over in Great Britain. And they were kind of, it's one of those, I see the value in them because there is an intense value in them. They had a lot, they're sort of the lens through which we can view the shifting morality of like the 70s and 80s, and how a lot of older filmmakers were viewing sexual liberation and gender roles. But for people who are not already deeply entrenched in horror, they're gore flicks. And I feel like because they were so popular and they reached such mainstream popularity, I feel like that's what a lot of people's perception of horror became. And that's kind of where it stopped for them because a lot of really cool things were happening under there, especially in foreign markets. So have you sort of found that? Have you discovered that that is kind of a bias you're dealing with when you're talking to people about horror, that, oh, it's this very unintelligent shock 'em genre?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when I'm discussing horror, I tend to uh, find that I come up on that wall. A lot of the people I talk to are people that I've like got. I particularly enjoy like going to haunted houses and things like that, and while that's just like kind of a cheap entertainment thrill factor, I also enjoy like the deeper meaning behind, because some of those are based on horror films specifically. Um, but a lot
Mhm.
of people are focused so hard on like the torture porn genre because people of my age remember like Hostel and Saw and all of those, like Human
Yeah.
Centipede and things like that. So
Yeah.
people tend to focus on that because that's such the mainstream, like in your face, this is what's happening. Horror films that older films like Halloween and the slasher fix and all that tend to either get buried, or films like Midsummer tend to be written off as shock value. Uh,
Now, I won't lie, I feel like there were aspects of the predecessor to Midsummer, Hereditary, that were just sort of shock value. I
yes,
definitely feel like Midsummer matured. Um,
yeah.
but
Hereditary definitely felt like the first foray into an attempt at flipping horror on its head, and Midsummer was the answer to it. So,
yeah. Um, So interesting question then, because we've talked a lot about things that are mainstream and kind of how what goes mainstream affects our opinion of a genre overall, which can be said for all genres, really. But horror seemed to catch it in the neck from that angle. Do you think then that open accessibility to horror genre films on Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime are sort of changing the game at all? Do you think the access to horror films instantly on streaming without having to wait for them to open at a theater and having to compete with other films at the theater, do you feel like that might be changing the perception of horror, or do we still have more to work against in order to kind of have non-horror fans see it for what it is, which is a deeply nuanced and faceted genre?
I definitely think that the streaming side of it is still working against that perception,
Oh.
because streaming is so like, if you read the synopsis and you don't like it, or you watch the trailer and you don't necessarily like it, you're still not going to click on it, and you're still not going to play it. Like I feel like for me it has opened my eyes to a bunch of different subgenres of horror, which there are a million of. But that's just one person's experience. I think that a lot of people fall prey to the shock factor and the real quick, like the not slow burn, whereas that's like my personal favorite, is the really slow build up over time to a, not necessarily like a big blowout culmination of like climax for a horror movie, but I think a lot of people, if it's not written on the package, so to speak, as
Hmm.
a certain type of horror, it's not going to appeal to them, even if it is available immediately on stream. I think.
Well, so here's another thing then,
Mhm.
because I actually have sort of the opposite opinion. Um, but I can actually fully see where you're coming from. But just to sort of deepen the discussion then, if you feel like people won't click on something because of what it says on the package, like you were making that point just a second ago that, oh, I don't like what it says on the package, I'm not going to click on it. Do you feel like because there's more access to different kinds of horror films, it might actually broaden the horizons of what the genre is because, oh, I don't like what that one says, let's try this one instead? Because I do know that Hulu has been doing a huge push to present independent horror films every year. Um, and they've also opened up horror TV shows like Castle Rock, which actually seem to have been drawing in more mainstream audiences. So what you're saying, or what at least what I think you're saying, is that people Have we lost AG? All right. So it looks like we've lost AG. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try and get them back in. And if we can't, then we will just wrap that up here. But so one discussion point that I want to go ahead and challenge you guys to is, what do you think the perception of horror is here in the modern era, where accessibility to films is greater and we don't have as much competition? Meaning that, I suppose what I mean by competition is, say you have a limited income, and as the prices of movie theaters rise, you're sort of having to very carefully pick and choose what films you go to. So obviously, if something is a little bit more mainstream and has better reviews, chances are more people are going to go to that. So do you feel like that has sort of lessened the influence of horror films or the perception of what they are? Or do you feel like being able to access horror films instantaneously, and not necessarily horror films you've seen before, has kind of widened people's perception of what horror is capable of? Um, Oops, it looks like AG has lost their internet. So that may be all for us today. So some final thoughts that I definitely wanted us to think about is horror important? We've talked about the definitions, we've talked about the impressions, we've talked about how horror should feel. Or is there any real perception of how horror should feel? Or is there a variable perception of how horror should feel? I know that me personally, I'm on the train of the feeling of horror is variable, because again, we have all those different lenses that we're viewing horror through. If someone is suffering from anxiety or some other form of functional dysfunction, they may have a really different idea of a horror film than someone who may have suffered from abuse, or someone who may have had a quote unquote kind of vanilla life leading up to it. But the point is, I feel like all horror is going to feel slightly different, because again, we are viewing it through these different life lenses. And I definitely feel like that's important for horror. AG is restarting their router, so we may have them again shortly. Ba-da-ba-ba. All right. So, like I said, our next section is horror important? Basically meaning, do we feel like horror as a genre adds anything to entertainment, to our perception of the world, to learning, or just our lives in general? I personally am very much on the train of horror is important. One of the big things that draws me to horror and keeps me watching, reading, listening to horror is we can always learn a little bit about ourselves, or about a society, or about a culture through what horror they are producing, what horror is getting popular, and what horror is saying in these pieces that get popular. I mean, even in films like AG and I were discussing how we feel like horror kind of has a perception that is stuck in the slasher renaissance. That doesn't mean that horror is stuck. Horror is actually making beautiful advances, especially if we look at things like Get Out, if we look at works like Le Revenant, which, by the way, is a French zombie movie, which really, really kind of defied a lot of what the genre had been doing up to that point. But again, zombies, a discussion for another day. If you start me, I'll be here forever. But a lot of the perception of horror kind of stalls out at the slasher renaissance of like the 70s and 80s, which is a bit sad because it has been doing remarkable things. But more to the point, I feel like people have the wrong perception of slasher films. Yes, a slasher film can tend towards the lowbrow, especially some of the newer ones, but we can still learn something very important about a society through what they're portraying in their slasher films, or even what they're laughing at in their slasher films, because we can't discount comedy in horror as a genre either. And it looks like we have AG back, so AG can actually join us for the final leg of the discussion.
I'm alive.
Hello, AG. We were just wrapping up our episode with the discussion of, is horror important? So I was just going over with any viewers we may happen to have. May God have mercy on their souls. Does horror as a genre add something to our society? Does it give us any new concepts? Does it tell us anything? Is horror worth it, basically? And I was expressing that I really think it is, because even if we look at some of the more lowbrow films like the slasher renaissance of the 70s and 80s, they still tell us a little bit about ourselves. Like, how did we view gender roles in that period in time? How did we view sexual liberation and the morality of it at that point in time? Like, look at all the things we can learn about society just from the original release of Carrie with Sissy Spacek.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I personally feel like horror is very important. It's almost like a social barometer. And I also brought up that horror can also teach us what we need to laugh at, because horror comedy is absolutely a genre. We absolutely 100% cannot discount Tucker and Dale versus Evil, which was
No.
important for taking perceptions of a genre and flipping them over. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute. Is horror important?
I definitely think so. I at least for me, on a personal level, that it is important. It has formed my opinions on many things, whether it be film or television or fiction or society in general. I think that a lot of the times, whether it be a blockbuster horror film or a film that is a little off to the sidelines, I think that we can really judge a period in time by its horror films. Uh, whether or not it's because those specific directors or producers feel like they can get away with more by being in the horror genre, like they can sneak a little bit more social commentary the uh into the mix, as opposed to like a big blockbuster hit,
which has a lot of sponsors that you're going to need to please,
yeah,
because that budget's got to come from somewhere. Whereas you have horror films with a shoestring budget that they don't need to make a whole lot of money back. So they're pretty free to tell whatever story they want. For the most part, there are, of course, your AAA horror games, your big budget horror films.
mm-hmm.
But typically you don't get that kind of budget unless you've already proven yourself, and unless the studio already kind of knows what you're about.
Yeah.
So
The most like face value representation of, I guess, what I'm trying to say is like Get Out in recent times,
which was actually something I referenced.
yeah. when I
one of
was
the
busy dying.
one of the things I wanted to make sure to reference is because we were talking about we feel like the perception of horror has stalled. I don't at all want people to think that the genre has stalled, because the genre is
Oh.
moving ahead in leaps and bounds, and Get Out is one of the films that is kind of changing the game. So please continue.
Yeah, I just in the sense that Get Out is definitely one of the biggest social barometer films, I think, of recent in the last couple of years, or how many ever years that
Oh
came
yeah.
out ago. But I mean, race has always and will always be a thing. And Get Out was just like balls to the walls. We're gonna talk about this, and you're gonna watch it. And
So interestingly enough, I think we could say that for a lot of his films.
oh,
Um,
100%.
because I remember I heard very recently that they were remaking Candyman, and my initial response was just my anus clenched, because it is such a racially driven film. And I was
Yeah.
like, I'm not really sure this is the film we should be remaking right now. And then the person who told me was like, Jordan Peele is taking care of it. And I'm like, tell me the story. Sit me
Well
down
then,
on the
yeah.
story carpet, because if anybody, I feel like if anybody is going to retell the story of Candyman, or if it's going to be remade, it needs to be by a POC or somebody who can see the horror of it through that lens. I'm doing a lot of talking about lenses, but that's
I mean,
it's
yeah.
really the best analogy for it. So it has been over an hour that we have been running our gums about the spookies. And I feel like that is it for today. There is so much more that we could go on about. There, I had a little bit more where we were going to talk about the kind of the mythological impacts of horror, and it kind of even as far back as Edinburgh and the Flodden Wall. We were telling horror stories as moralistic or as teaching guides, but we just don't have time, and I'm sure you're tired of listening to us talk. So we will probably end up doing an episode about mythology and folklore. Um,
Yes.
AG has been a delight, so I will, even if AG is not here every episode, AG will definitely be a staple. Episodes to look forward to are mythology in horror, or horror in mythology. I know that we have an episode planned that is going to be um, horror in video games and the analogy of horror in video games, and we're going to be focusing on things like Silent Hill, Outlast, Evil Within, and even some of the eco horror that you can find within Death Stranding. So we're going to be looking at that. We will also be looking at cosmic horror and all of the different myriad genres of horror in film. So until next time, that is the view from 6 Feet Under. Stay safe out there. And to all of you, have fun going bump in the night, guys.
Goodbye.